Thank you very much, William, for the opportunity to present the book. So my name is Oksana Myshlovska. I'm a senior researcher at the University of Bern and also at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And my area of expertise is in politics of memory, on regionalism, and also on divided memory in Ukraine. Today I'm going to present to you the forthcoming book, which is called Regionalism Without Regions, Reconceptualizing Ukraine's Heterogeneity, and it is co-edited by Ulrich Schmied, who is professor at the University of St. Gallen, and myself. The book will be published very soon by the Central University Press, and kind of as today I have received the final edit, so hopefully the book will be out very soon. In the remaining time, I will talk about several things. So first, I will start with an overview of the project of which the book is part of. So then I will move into data collection, overview of data collection. Then I will talk about the data visualization and the website on which all of the data collected in the framework of the project is available. And then finally, I will go into the overview of the book and the core findings of the book. So the book is part of an international interdisciplinary project, which is called Region, Nation and Beyond, Reconceptualizing a Transcultural and Interdisciplinary Reconceptualization of Ukraine. And this project was based at the University of St. Gallen, and it started in 2011 and lasted till 2015. And it has been quite a unique project that it's brought together about 40 scholars from different countries, namely Ukraine, Poland, United States, Germany, Switzerland. And also, beyond being an interdisciplinary project, also a unique feature of this project was that it brought together more established scholars and also young scholars. And it has really been very rewarding for young scholars who were able to grow together with this project. This project, participants were divided into 6 groups. As I mentioned, it was an interdisciplinary project. So we had one group focused on identity, then one focused on history, language, literature, religion, and economy. And each group, they worked separately, where they kind of proceeded with their own work, but also we met at least once a year as a whole group to discuss the project and how the project was proceeding. Now I will talk about about the data collection. So as a group, we have designed comprehensive data collection, and the book is the outcome of this kind of a long process of defining the research methodology and the methodologies of data collection. First, we started with a big survey, which was kind of each working group had one part in the survey, and the survey was the first survey of 6,000 respondents, took place in 2013. Just several months before the beginning of the Euromaidan and the conflict. And the second was again with the same methodology with some minor differences taken in 2015. And the third one was repeated in 2017. And as I mentioned, that each working group had part of the survey. So we had the group on identities, which has included questions about 14 territorial and non-territorial identification items, and they have looked kind of not only kind of in identification along these 17 identification items. They have also looked at intensity from on a scale from 1 till 5. Then also I was part of the historical group. We have included questions on historical memory, on different practices, mnemonic practices, attitudes to different historical events, personalities, monuments, and so on. Also, this historical part included different visions of historical belonging of Ukraine, such as European, Slavic, or unique version of Ukrainian history. The literature working group, they have included question on reading practices, preferred languages of reading, and also they have included also knowledge of different authors in the literary canon in Ukraine. Next group, language, they included a variety of questions on language attitude, then religion. Religious group looked at religious beliefs, religious denominations, religious practices, and also economic group. For me, it was one of the most interesting because they included questions that looked at the levels, at the attitudes to risk, both individual and business. Then they have looked also at attitudes at the level of envy, and also they have looked at corruption, like attitudes to corruption, both kind of and informal practices. Both as perception of corruption in relationship with different state institutions, and also own perception of corruptions, what kind of practices the respondents are involved themselves when they deal with the state institution. Several groups, in addition to the survey, this was the most important data collection tool. Then we had also several groups which have taken also other methods, have used other methods of data collection. So the language group, they have conducted in-depth interviews in several regions. The same for the literature group, where they had in-depth interviews with teachers, with school teachers, and also they have interviewed, they had several in-depth expert interviews with several young writers. So then also we had some other in-depth interviews. So for example, the chapter which is focused on the Euromaidan, it has looked at has conducted several in-depth interviews during the Euromaidan, and also a very interesting survey on values was undertaken in 2015, and it appears in the chapter by Yaroslav Hrecak, who looks at kind of new regional divisions and cross-cutting divisions on the basis of values, which had 20,000 respondents, and it was using the methodology of the World Values Survey. So as I mentioned, we have all of this data which have been collected. We have a website where all of this data is posted. It's the name of the website is uaregio.org. So it's all available to other researchers. Now I will go into the core findings of the chapter. And first I would like to highlight several general findings of the edited volume. So first, our core finding is that we see that Ukraine is regionally differentiated, that indeed there are many dividing lines running across Ukraine, but we were not able to identify any stable regions or homogeneous regions, which could be explained in terms of identifications, historical memory, and all of other different measures which we have used, which we have studied, like language, religious beliefs, preferences for authors, and so on. And what we also saw that we have found this term used by Yaroslav Hrecak in his chapter, that this kind of overall statement that Ukraine is a regionally differentiated country, but without any homogeneous region. So we have found this title of Ukraine without regions, with an emphasis on Ukraine's heterogeneity. Also, second, that in kind of beyond this traditional study where you look at identities, we also have tried to look at more longer terms historical legacies as explaining different regional differences in Ukraine, and more specifically how these historical, long-term historical and cultural legacies, how they are reflected in attitudes to, for example, risk, envy, or corruption. Also, another overall big finding, which also cuts across several chapters, is that divisions which are based on age, education, social status are becoming more prominent, and also this become evident in several chapters of our edited volume. Overall, we started with a definition of region as looking at relatively homogeneous patterns of beliefs which could be mapped. So that was the overall definition which we have accepted, and that's why the importance of kind of the surveys and different data collection methods which have been used. In the first chapter, which has been specifically on identification, the most interesting finding is that the chapter has included this in the survey 14 territorial and non-territorial identification targets, and what as I mentioned already, in the scale from 1 to 5 to see the intensity of identities and also strengths of identification, complexity, and internal consistency. That's also quite was innovative in that chapter, and what we were able to see, which has reconfirmed some of the earlier studies, that we see that there is one homogeneous region which encompasses Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine, which is kind of with strong Ukrainian identity, and the methods used in this chapter, clustering method, it's this strong Ukrainian identity was resistant even to this clustering process. And also what this in this chapter, what was found that Eastern Ukraine, all regions, Eastern regions, that they have overall much weaker identification in all targets, and also most importantly, place and national identification are much weaker than in Central and in Eastern Ukraine. That's also another interesting correlation that was found in this chapter. It was between Ukrainian and local identity, which was positive, and a negative correlation between Russian and place identity and local identity. And again, the co-authors of this chapter, they argue that this repeats some of the earlier studies which have been done, but anyhow, it's also kind of important that our survey has reconfirmed some of these earlier studies. Then, as I mentioned myself, I was part of the history group, and we looked at historical legacies, memories, and attitudes. And we started with the question, what are the legacies of previous state formation to which the Ukrainian lands belonged, like starting with the Polish influence, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish state, and also, most importantly, Russian both imperial and Soviet legacies. Also, we have tried to look at other legacies which are more regional to see if there are any legacies which can be identified in Ukraine. What we were able to find in this chapter is that Soviet legacies still remain the most prominent legacies and uniting legacies for the whole territory of Ukraine, but also we studied two trends such as a nationalization and regionalization of memory, which also showed quite interesting kind of regional differences. Where if you look at nationalization, there have been efforts to promote new heroes, new a celebration of new holidays throughout of Ukraine, and we have looked at what new holidays which have been promoted in the post-Soviet period, which are gaining in importance, and the ones which are not popular, remain not popular among the population. So for that also we looked at the regional memory, how the legacies of these different state formation and these long-term legacies, how different regions revive different regional historical figures, and also kind of references to their own regional historical past. As I mentioned, what we have found that Soviet holidays celebrated during the Soviet period, they remain the most popular, and the part which is focused on attitudes has looked at the popularity of, has put together Ukrainian and Soviet holidays, and has looked at the popularity and practicing of these holidays, and found that Soviet holidays such as Defenders of the Motherland Day or the Women's Day or the Victory Day, they may remain much more embedded in practices than the holidays which were introduced in the post-Soviet period. Also, we have looked at the historical meta-narratives, like dividing different historical figures into different historical meta-narratives, such as Ukrainian nationalist, National Democratic, Soviet, Russian Imperial, and it's also one of the core findings that none of these historical meta-narratives dominates in all regions of Ukraine. So we have a kind of a mixture of these different historical narratives across Ukraine. Then we looked at the polarizing issues, and there are a number of polarizing issues and figures, historical periods, and those remain the figures of Bandera and Lenin, but also Khmelnytsky, Gorbachev, Kravchuk, but also the three most dividing historical issues remain the OPA, the Second World War, and Holodomor. As I mentioned, the most important finding is that all of them are equally these meta-historical narratives. There is not a single macro region where one of these historical meta-narratives dominates. Then a very important finding in this mapping of historical memories is that we see that there is emerging age, social status divisions in comparison to regional divisions. So this also was visible in this analysis of different historical narratives, where kind of association with different historical narratives is differentiated more now by age, social status than by macro region. Then moving to the chapter on languages, this chapter has three parts, where they first looked at the long-term legacies and institutionalization, standardization of the Ukrainian language, and looking at this multiplicity of languages and on competition of Ukrainian with other languages in different regions, and gradual standardization of Ukrainian in different regions which belong to different state formation, most importantly in Russian and Austrian dominated parts of the territory. So these kind of the finding is that it has been different stages of standardization in different parts of Ukraine, and then the common standard of Ukrainian language only happens in the 1920s during the Soviet period. Then the second part of this chapter looks at the Soviet policies in the newly integrated regions during the Second World War, mainly Galicia, Budzak, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, and also showing how Soviet regime promoted homogeneity at the expense of the former dominant languages. So then we look, the last part of this language chapter, they look at the current situation, and they look at the kind of the known dividing lines in the attitude to the bilingualism and to the status of Russian as a second state language, but also importantly on the basis of interviews with school teachers. This part of the book was able to see what were the tendencies in 2012 with the adoption of the new law on languages, and also with change of policy on the school examination, in terms that this chapter has examined how the impact on the choice of Ukrainian at school and also by parents. And like one interesting conclusion of this chapter is that Donbass was the only region where parents were preferring to switch to the Russian language during this period. Then I'm moving to the next chapter on literary mediascapes, and this chapter looks at also very interesting phenomenon as regionalization of the literary mediascape, and in particular they look at the fragmentation of the book market at the beginning of independence, where the regional editors and regional publishing houses which contributed to this regionalization, where books would be available regionally but not at the national level. Also, this chapter looks at regional features of Ukrainian literature, different regional schools, fairs, literature fairs, festivals, and so on. Then this interesting finding is about the reading habits in this chapter, where the interesting finding is that the hours of reading and the size of home library that in the East is different than in the West, meaning that in the East, most importantly in Donbass, the inhabitants read more books and have larger home library. And also what this chapter found, that in southern region, they have the highest shares of those who are declared non-readers. Also, what this chapter found, that in Galicia there is a preference of reading of books in Russian, but overall in Ukrainian, but overall Russian language dominates as a preferred language of reading throughout of Ukraine, and central Ukraine and partially Eastern Ukraine also have a kind of preference for two languages of reading, both Ukrainian and Russian. Also, one of the findings of this chapter, which confirms the findings of other chapters, that the Soviet literary canon, meaning the authors who were read during the Soviet time, so Shevchenko, Franko, Lesya Ukrainka, they remain the most popular and the most widely known authors in Ukraine, while kind of the new authors of post-Soviet Ukraine remain also regionalized and much less known than the Soviet authors. Then I'm moving to religion. That's also this chapter. One of the most interesting findings is another statement that there were not found any kind of macro regions where religion identification creates such macro regions. What this chapter finds, that in the post-Soviet period there has been diversification of religious practices and overall growing role of religion in political and social spheres. Also, the chapter talks about the different denomination of what they call the national church, and they look at that Orthodox, the different denomination of the Orthodox Church and the Greek Catholic Church, even if they are regionally, some of them are regionally more concentrated, still they have national appeal and they see themselves as national churches. one of the interesting findings of this chapter is about what they call ambient phase, that there is a large share of the population which does not associate itself with any denomination, Orthodox denomination. It's 22% who call themselves as just Orthodox. And in this chapter, this is an important finding that there's an ambient phase and kind of absence of fixed religion identities which characterize overall religiosity. Next chapter on economy, it's, as I mentioned, it looks at regional differentiation in terms of attitudes to risks, both business and individual. Also, it's at levels of envy and on corruption and informal practices, and all of these subsections of the economy chapter, they find some interregional differentiation along all of these targets, but also, as in other cases, there is not a clear macro region which has been identified. Some of kind of clear regional trends which have been identified. It's just that inhabitants of western, northern, and central Ukraine, they are more willing to take risk vis-a-vis the rest of Ukraine, mostly east, south, and Donbass, and the interpretation was kind of using the great frontier hypothesis, like the levels, the progress of human settlement, to explain these differences in risk taking. Also, some differentiation was found for envy, where the levels at Donbass and has been found the region where there have been the highest levels of envy, and also higher levels of envy were found in Western Ukraine than in other regions. And this subsection explained these higher levels of envy in Donbass. They call this as the deprivation, the new deprivation hypothesis, which meaning that the high expectations which were not met in the region have been led to the situation of this high level of envy. The same for perception of corruption. There also has been found some regional differentiation, but also as not major macro level macro regions. The last two chapters, as I mentioned, they were added later to our book project, and one is by Yaroslav Hrecak on the new political geography in 2013 and 14. And he tries to go what he calls beyond identity, criticizing that there has been overemphasis in studying regional divisions in Ukraine on identities, where he has commissioned a separate survey which focuses on values, and he tested this division in terms of values of self-expression and values of survival, in trying to explain the success of the Euromaidan and trying to explain also the anti-Maidan, the failure of the Russian Spring and anti-Maidan. And again, here Yaroslav Hrecak, he also argues that social factors are becoming more important than the identities in explaining the success or failure of Maidan and Euromaidan. And the last chapter, it's focusing on the identity of the Euromaidan participants, and this chapter, as I already mentioned, was based on the in-depth interviews with Euromaidan participants, and this chapter was authored by Anna Chebotaryova, who is based at the University of St. Gallen, and her finding is that Euromaidan was this multi-ethnic, multicultural phenomenon, and really has served for the redefinition of a Ukrainian citizen. But at the same time, she looked at kind of this in-group favorism of Euromaidan participants, and also the othering of others. And who are these others? This out-group derogatory statements by Euromaidan participants, where she showed kind of the attitudes to the anti-Maidan participants, to the state authorities, police as being the other, which was also important for forming the identity of the Euromaidan participants. So finally, I would like to kind of finish again by reiterating the core message that we found that regionalism without region is the best represents this heterogeneity of Ukraine, and also the importance of these new dividing lines as the social status, age are becoming more important, and for that it will be very interesting for next studies on issues of regionalism and Ukraine to continue what we have started as part of this project. Overall process was very interesting. As I mentioned, this is an interdisciplinary project, and even to bring so many different disciplines into one project, it was a challenge, but also kind of was a big co-learning opportunity for everyone involved. Like for me personally, I was most interested in economics chapter, because it's really adds new kind of interpretation which we don't have in traditional studies of regionalism, which is mostly focused, as I mentioned, on identities, ethnic identities, religion, language, and so on. But looking at values and long-term behaviors, how these long-term trends influence current values, I found this the most interesting, and also in line with some of the most recent global research on kind of which explains economic development of countries, and it resonates with a famous Putnam study of Italy, northern Italy, and explaining interregional differences in Italy. So it was inspired by more global developments in the study of regionalism and kind of looking at these long-term patterns of economic development.